Okay, good evening. This is John Bushka. I want to talk a little bit about a question I've gotten recently about whether the second of my three Do Ask, Do Tell books would make a good documentary movie proposal. Would be this one right here, Do Ask, Do Tell When Liberty is Stressed. And if you go to the table of contents of that book, you'll see that it's a collection of essays. But the most interesting part of it is probably launching a Bill of Rights too. And in general, it would be possible to imagine doing not just a movie, but a series of videos or a series of episodes on a video channel, on any number of streaming channels, about the idea of proposing a Bill of Rights too. Now, that brings up the way you would do it with my book. And I've sort of outlined a general strategy for doing it. First, as a part 0, I'd introduce the book, and I would focus on chapter 2, the idea of proposing a Bill of Rights too. And then I would explain the book a little bit as to how some of the supplementary chapters that followed the Bill of Rights 2 chapter address certain special problems that come up in considering it. But because this book was published in 2002, it has to be brought up to date, and there are many issues today that weren't known at the time. So this is the way a professionally done series like on a video streaming channel might be approached. First of all, you would start by reviewing the Alito and Clarence Thomas opinions when overturning Roe versus Wade in 2022. Remember that was leaked in early May, so that was controversial. Look at the stare decisis doctrine. Go back and look at Plessy versus Ferguson. Then look at how various amendments to the Constitution, especially the 14th, but several others, basically reinforce the Bill of Rights, how the incorporation doctrine works, and then consider some special issues that have come up since then, like suffrage and prohibition. Then part 2 is review the methods. There are basically 2 times 2 of them for amending the Constitution. Some of them haven't been used. Consider and also compare that to the effectiveness of using federal law, such as the recent reinforcement of gay marriage in 2002 after the Clarence Thomas sort of threatened the right of privacy and some other things you'll remember. And then how Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in 2011 with the help of Congress. It wasn't done by the courts. Then you would go through each purported group of fundamental rights and track them back to the Constitution. And each part of these would be an episode. So you'd have First Amendment rights, and you would also include whether they include the freedom of reach that you get with the internet, as well as association and assembly and all the other things. You'd also consider whether corporate censorship, particularly from the left, has the effect of interfering with First Amendment rights. You'd consider the Second Amendment, which I didn't really distress very much in the book, only once, and whether the militia issue interferes with this being an individual right. And remember the Heller decision versus D.C. in 2008, the Supreme Court said that it is an individual right. But you consider the practical problems with gun control, which are enormous. Part 3C would be due process rights, substantive due process especially, which was questioned by Alito and Thomas. And that gets into the rights of life, and that gets into, of course, the controversy over Roe versus Wade and euthanasia and other things, and then freedom of movement, property. It's mainly the 5th and 14th Amendments, but also the whole idea of right to privacy, which involves contraception, sodomy laws, maybe gay marriage. Amendments 6, 7, and 8 do have some bearing on due process. Privacy was introduced under my own treatment of don't ask, don't tell in my books, and could extend some of today's gender issues, whether a person has a right to declare their own gender and whether that affects privacy, for example, in women's spaces, in single-spec spaces like restrooms and so forth, that could come under consideration. Part 3D, equal protection rights based on the 14th Amendment, civil rights laws based on them, the connection to DEI today, whether equity and equality are the same thing they aren't, reverse discrimination issues, whether people should think in terms of belonging to groups, oppressed groups, or think of themselves as individuals. That's important. Freedom from expropriation, which is the Fourth Amendment largely, and civil asset forfeiture. And then the whole question about the right to vote, how we know that elections are good. And then the last part, which would be really important, is how rights could be affected by external challenges, like war, which invokes the idea of conscription. The power grid security, we need to pay a lot more attention to the grid, both from external enemies, the EMP issue, but also and attacks on power stations, but also on the sun, solar storms. We don't seem to have as good an understanding of sunspots and the cycle and large Carrington-style events and how likely they are, as we should, because I'm really trying to get the facts on those, and it's hard to do that. Then maybe how climate change in the future could restrict personal behavior like driving alone, or whether the infrastructure for electric cars will eventually be good enough that you can charge them quickly anywhere. And then last of all, public health, the lockdown issue during the COVID pandemic, business closures, the controversy over vaccines, and then even some issues that we haven't talked about a lot over STDs that even came up during the AIDS epidemic that have public health implications, the blood issue and so forth. Those are all things that you would talk about in a series that was devoted to fundamental rights. So that's basically my take on how you would do a video series on a streaming channel. Might be 10 or so episodes. It would require a lot of resources. It would require professionals talking to law for professors about constitutional law and amending the Constitution, talking to experts about climate change and the power grid, talking to also people about some of the culture war issues and whether they have constitutional implications. And as a general rule, there's kind of a parallel between what I said in the book. Remember that I talked about it not only in the second book, but also in the first book. I think I can bring up the table of contents for the second book, but in the first book I also did. In chapter 6, I proposed a right to privacy amendment. I also have a little booklet called Our Fundamental Rights that isn't part of the Do Ask, Do Tell series, and it doesn't have a POD publisher. It's just something I've distributed myself that was written in 1998. It's possible that I could have to amplify that. So those are my thoughts on how I would do it, but I'll probably have to polish this video and work on it a lot more to make it a lot more convincing. But I've gotten questions recently on it, so I did want to present it to you.